Perfect.
So hi everybody, my name's Kathryn Dooks. I'm an employment partner at Kemp Little, and I'm currently helping employer clients mainly to negotiate things like the coronavirus job retention scheme and also, unfortunately, redundancies as well. So very pleased to be joining LHH today, and thank you for inviting me to join you.
Thanks, Kathryn. I'm JC Townend. I'm CEO for the UK and Ireland of LHH Penna. Well, actually, we have just rebranded, so we're now just LHH. We are one of the largest HR consulting companies in the UK and Ireland, focusing on outplacement and coaching and talent development.
Hi, I'm Mel Barclay. I'm Head of Career Transition for LHH. And I'm here today just to give you a little bit of background about the outplacement process and what that might look like for individuals who are being made redundant.
Thanks. So I thought we would start with a bit of scene setting of what we've been seeing over the last few weeks whilst we've been advising clients and kind of what the quote new normal is. And it's probably interesting to contrast it with the last big recession that we saw, which was in 2008, 2009 with the financial crisis. And at that time, 10 years ago, we very much spent about a period of about 9 months just constantly giving redundancy advice. This time it's been very different, and that's because of the interventions that the government's made. So we had, from the middle of March, we had about 3 or 4 weeks where we were constantly giving advice on furloughing staff under the coronavirus job retention scheme. And we also had a period of time where we were advising clients on making pay cuts across the board or going down to 4-day week, those sorts of measures. But it's safe to say that currently at the moment, not that many clients have gone down the redundancy route. But I think that is starting to change. I'm already getting inquiries from clients about making collective redundancies. And I think certainly in sort of Q2, Q3, we're going to see much more of that, particularly as the coronavirus job retention scheme comes to an end. And you may have heard this week that it's currently been extended until October for all sectors and employers. So it'll be in its current format until the end of July. And then from August onwards, the expectation is that employers will still pay staff 80% of pay, but that the support from the government will reduce probably to 60% initially and then down from there. And also there is, the government has said that it'll be possible to bring staff back into the workplace on a part-time basis as well. But we're going to get more detail of that from the end of May. So watch this space for more information about the developments there. But I think where that's leading to, where it's bringing employers to, is thinking about what happens when the furlough scheme ends and that support's not available anymore, or it's being reduced. And I think careful planning and strategizing now will reap the rewards down the line. Firstly, to minimize disruption to the business of any redundancy process. Also minimizing the legal risk for you. And finally, helping to maximise productivity of staff who are left behind. And that's the focus of today's session. So I'm going to move on and look at sort of 5 key considerations for when you're planning your strategy from a legal perspective for making redundancies. I don't have time today to go into every single step you should take to undertake the perfect redundancy. Although Kemp Little is running a redundancy masterclass, which we're planning to do in the next couple of weeks. So, do keep your eyes peeled for that session. And we'll go into more detail in that. But these are just things to think about if you're starting to consider redundancies and starting to think about what that could look like in terms of the shape of the process and what steps you need to take. So the first consideration is a cost benefit analysis. Is it even worth doing redundancies in the first place? And this has become much more relevant this time around because of the coronavirus job retention scheme, and particularly now it's been extended till October. If you make redundancies, when will you actually realise the cost saving of doing that? By the time you've done so, will the economy have improved and you might be needing to hire again? So it's important to consider the full time scale, not just the 30 or 45-day collective consultation process, if that applies to you, but also the time and cost of the planning phase before you start that, and employee notice periods that you're going to have to pay out, typically between 1 and 3 months usually. and then the redundancy package and other costs such as legal costs. For example, if you use settlement agreements for an enhanced redundancy package, there'll necessarily be legal costs because you'll have to contribute towards employees getting legal advice on those documents. And also things like outplacement support and other benefit continuation and those sorts of things. So, and the other factor to build into all of this as well is kind of the impact on morale and productivity of those who are left behind, and that may be unquantifiable, but again, it comes into when you start to realise the cost saving of making the redundancies. So the second key consideration when you're thinking about your strategy is one that's much more closely defined by the legal obligations that you have, and that's how many redundancies you're having and the impact that the number will have on the length of the process that you'll need to undertake. So if you're proposing to dismiss 20 or more employees at one establishment in a 90-day period, then you need to undertake a 30-day collective consultation process. If it's less than 20, it's just an individual consultation process, so it can be much more straightforward. But if it's 20 or more, then it's 30 days. And if it's 100 or more employees in a 90-day period, then it's 45 days consultation process. And bear in mind that the penalty for failing to undertake these processes is 90 days pay per employee. So it's very much a penalty. It's definitely a disincentive for not undertaking the consultation process. One just small pointer is that there's this concept of the dismissals taking place at one establishment. And what that means is it's probably best demonstrated by some case law from the Woolworths case, when Woolworths went into administration and then closed down. And in that case, each branch of Woolworths was treated as its own establishment, and therefore collective consultation wasn't required in that case, because at each branch there were less than 20 employees who were affected, or in most of the branches there were less than 20 employees who were affected. So the court held that collective consultation wasn't required there. So it's worth thinking about that and about the makeup of your workforce and where they're distributed as to whether the collective consultation will be triggered. The third consideration is what, if collective redundancy consultation is triggered, what should that look like? What does that involve? And therefore, what planning do you need to do to be able to kick that off? Well, the first element of that is that you need to consult with employee representatives of the staff rather than consulting with all the staff together. So if you have a trade union that's already recognised by the company, then you'd consult with that trade union. If you already had a pre-existing employee representative body and that adequately matched up with or aligned to the group of employees who were affected by the redundancies, then you could consult with that body. But if you don't have either of those things, then strictly speaking, you're required by the legislation to allow employees to elect representatives. And I guess particularly if employees are furloughed at the moment, but also because people are working from home largely, that may be a slightly trickier process at the moment, although online balloting is possible. So typically you need to allow sort of 2 to 4 days to go through that process of allowing employees to nominate themselves to be an elected representative and then have an election process. The other thing to think about with the collective consultation process is that you have to provide the employee representatives with certain specified information. So you'd need to pull that together in advance of the collective consultation process starting. And you need to file what's known as an HR1 form, which is a form that you submit to the Secretary of State for Business, informing them that you're making more than 20 redundancies. And again, you've got to do that at least 30 or 45 days before the first dismissals take place. And you need to provide a copy of the HR1 form to the elected representatives. So these are all things to start to pull together before you kick off the process. And then obviously you've got the 30 or 45 day consultation process, which you do with a view to reaching agreement. You don't, strictly speaking, have to get the employee reps agreement to every single measure that you're taking, but it's with a view to doing that. So that's the expectation there. The fourth thing to think about when you're thinking about your strategy is whether you want to make life much easier for yourselves in some ways by just asking for volunteers for redundancy, or whether you're going to go through a formal selection process. I say make life easy for yourself. It's probably not that much easier if you ask for volunteers, particularly where you're making more than 20 dismissals, because you still need to go through a collective redundancy consultation process, even if you're only using volunteers for redundancy, where there's more than 20 of them. And you also need to think about what happens if not enough people volunteer, and you'll probably have to therefore go through a compulsory process and go through a selection process. In addition, you need to think about the fact that you won't necessarily have control over who leaves if you use a voluntary process. So you may well lose your best staff or your most experienced staff. And there are other unintended consequences as well. For example, it can have an impact on the age profile of your workforce, experience and skills available, and even things like your gender diversity stats, gender pay gap, and things like that. So it's worth having a think about all those unintended consequences too. I mean, arguably, using volunteers for redundancy is better for morale. It may also be better for productivity in terms of the staff left behind, but I guess that depends on whether you're left with a large group of inexperienced staff or not. So it's worth bearing those factors in mind as well. On the other hand, if you use selection, then yes, you get to literally select who remains, so you can choose the most experienced and skilled staff. Normally what you would do is pool together anyone whose duties are broadly interchangeable across the workforce, and then you use a selection process based on the skills and knowledge required for the job, trying to use as objective criteria as possible. I guess the downside to this is that there'll be more people who are potentially at risk of redundancy because you're pooling them and putting them all at risk and then making a selection, and more people therefore unsettled, and again an impact on productivity. You also need to think about the process of how you'll go about making the selection. So typically it would be a moderated process where you use 2 or more scorers and then pull the scores together, because that's a fairer approach and is less likely to lead to allegations of favoritism or bias. And you would consult with the employees about both the selection criteria and the process as part of the consultation. So it could be a slightly longer consultation process as a result. I think most employers these days probably do go down the selection route. Certainly that's my experience of the current climate, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether that changes as the next few months develop. The next factor to think about is the financial package you're offering to staff. And this slide is just a reminder of the absolute minimum you have to give to staff on redundancy. So first of all, they'll be entitled to their notice pay. And you need to think about whether you're going to ask staff to work out their notice or to be paid in lieu of it. And then if they have 2 years service, they're also entitled to a statutory redundancy payment, and the calculation for that is set out on the slide. And they're also entitled to payment out of their accrued but untaken holiday. And then on the next slide, I've set out some considerations of sort of strategy points you need to think about in terms of whether you should enhance the package or not. So a lot of this comes down to things like brand, employer reputation, employer brand, and LHH are going to talk about this in more detail. So obviously, if you enhance the package, that's going to mean that people leaving your organisation and going out into the marketplace are going to be happier than if you'd just given them the basic package. If you do enter into an enhanced package, you would typically use settlement agreements, and that would also help you therefore to manage legal risk and provide you with certainty that you weren't going to get any claims, which is another advantage. And also, in some circumstances, employers use an enhanced package to try and do a slightly quicker process and to try and truncate the collective redundancy consultation. I have to say that happens most often in sort of large financial services organisations, which don't necessarily want to do the collective consultation route, and might be less relevant for most employers, because it would be a question of buying out the failure to consult, the collective consultation claim. There is also a question mark as to whether you can effectively waive that claim under a settlement agreement. It's a bit of a technical legal point, that one, so I won't go further into the detail of that, but yeah, it's another factor to think about when you're thinking about an enhanced package. In my experience, most employers of what I would describe as professionals do enhance the package in some way, just because of the very low sums involved in statutory redundancy payments. So I'm now going to pass on to JC and Mel, who are going to talk in a bit more detail about the support that they can provide.
Great, thanks, Kathryn. I'm going to turn it over to Mel first, who's the head of our outplacement services at LHH.
Thanks, JC. So I think you've got a pretty clear idea in terms of outplacement and I suppose the technical process around making people redundant. But at LHH, we work with over 30,000 candidates a year. And I think it's really important to probably understand some of the benefits of individuals being offered and taking up outplacement services such as ours. You just go to the next slide. Thanks, Rachel. So for individuals, and I can't stress enough how much, even out of those 30,000 people that we support every year, every single person comes with different ideas about what they want to do, different challenges that they're facing. Therefore, in terms of the support that we provide, there are some key themes, but there's also a lot of variations as well. The key thing that we notice with people who are given outplacement support is that very often they're coming to us at a very low place. They're going through a massive change. And even if they've experienced outplacement or redundancy previously, it still really does take the wind out of their sails, and they often need a period of time to recalibrate, think about what they want to do, and essentially build their confidence. Our experienced career transition consultants spend probably the majority of the first week supporting individuals in trying to build that confidence, help them to restore some resilience, and equip themselves with tools so that they can actually manage and navigate their way through what can be a very, very challenging process. A couple of the other areas that we focus on will be upskilling and retraining. So for many individuals, particularly in the current climate, many are recognising that the roles that they've been made redundant from no longer exist or have changed dramatically. So we encourage all of the candidates that work with us to consider how to refresh skills. We offer things like LinkedIn Learning and access to other e-learning modules, and often looking at retraining possibilities as well. I think for many people it's an opportunity to explore something they'd never considered before. And working with us on a programme, it does give them time and the opportunity to perhaps explore those options. We often direct people when they first join us to think about a structured route to market. And not everybody's looking for a similar role. Some people want to explore self-employment, maybe transferring skills into a very, very different area or different sector. Some people are looking at retirement or even a portfolio career. But the key for people working with an organisation like LHH is that we can help to provide them with a roadmap and a plan so that that route to market is an easy route and it's one that actually makes sense. I've always said to candidates that I've worked with that working on a CV and things like a LinkedIn profile isn't really rocket science. It's something that most people can do as individuals. But when you work with an organisation that has huge knowledge across broad sectors and has consultants that have experience across many types of organisations, that structured route means that we can get candidates there more quickly. And I think in the current climate, speed is of the essence. People financially don't want to take risks, and they really want to make sure that they're engaging with the job market as quickly as possible. Because we work with a huge number of very large organisations who equally are making people redundant, but also looking to hire new talent, we can provide connections to jobs. And again, for individuals that are being made redundant who come and work with us, it isn't simply a matter of focusing on creating a CV. It's also about applying for roles and getting out into that market as quickly as possible. So a lot of the work that we do is to actually liaise with our client organisations to see what hiring needs they have and to direct our candidates to those. Of course, we focus on all the usual best practice. Yes, our individuals will have great CVs. We'll support them with understanding how social media can help them in their job search. We can help them with things like preparing for virtual interviews, which is what a lot of people are having to encounter currently. And of course, we'll also encourage them to network. And I think the final point that I want to make is that all of this is also about creating a support network. I think for people, this can be a real life-changing period, and for them to have a support network above and beyond their family and friends is something that really does sustain them and builds their confidence to move into a new role.
Great, thank you, Mel. So I think that gives you, hopefully many of you know what Outplacement is. It's offering a support service to people as you're making them redundant to help them land on their feet. And I have to say, you know, I'm embarrassed that in 20 years as an executive in my early career, I didn't even know that Outplacement existed, and actually never even learned about it till I myself was made redundant and was offered a package. And I really found it, you know, it's fantastic in helping people to land on their feet, people that haven't searched for a job in 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 years. Just even if they're very senior executives that, you know how to get around a computer, know how to write a CV, they just don't even know what the job market is presenting now. So I think offering that kind of support is helpful. Rachel, can you go to the next slide? So that's, it's a really feel-good program, but you know, really what businesses obviously are encountering now is real pounds and pence. It's really the financial bottom line, which is forcing companies to even undertake the thought of redundancy. And so it's a really challenging thing to be thinking about. And so when you're thinking about the total package and the total cost of reorganizing, restructuring your company, you know, it's useful to think about, okay, you can see, obviously, it's a great thing to do for the candidate, the person that's being made redundant, but how does it support your business? So I think the first thing is you know, going back to the legal point, we do find it does reduce your legal costs. So there was a study done by the Center for Organizational Research that found legal costs for companies that did offer some kind of outplacement support to redundant employees, found their legal costs were reduced as much as 72%. So it can be a real bottom line impact for the company, which is important. But second, and I think more importantly, is morale and productivity of your remaining staff. So another study that we did found that people that remained in the business after a major redundancy had a 40% drop in morale and a 20% drop in productivity. And that drop in productivity right when you're probably wanting to squeeze people to get more out of each person because your staff is very lean. So what we found is people knowing that their colleagues that have been made redundant are being taken care of and helping them to land on their feet with job search skills helps improve productivity for the remainers. It also makes them a little less worried and a little less skittish at work, you know, because they're not thinking, oh, do I need to be getting ready for a job now just in case I'm suddenly made redundant. Instead, they can just focus on the business at hand, which is really important. And interestingly, even for people that take voluntary redundancy, we find that they don't know what they're getting into when they get into the job market. So they might get a 6-month, year-long severance package, which they think is fantastic. But without special support skills to get by in the new job market, they may find that they're in trouble in terms of landing a new job. And then they still have that resentment back to their employer, even though they took a voluntary redundancy. Third way that this supports your business is brand and reputation. So we've had examples. I had a great example from last autumn when we were working with a major manufacturer that had to go through very difficult plant closure. And you know, the company, the employees were very upset. They got very, very generous severance packages of up to 2 years' salary. And nevertheless, were very upset and concerned that that money was still going to run out and they didn't have the job skills to move into the marketplace or move into another industry. And I thought that was a great example where we were able to come in and give outplacement support, and even just after the first presentation to the employees and to the unions, all the concerns settled down. And actually a union executive met me right after the presentation and said, aha, I see the company is doing everything they can for us. So even unions are very, they're reasonable. They know if a business, if a market has to shut down, they understand that. But they really like to know that you're doing everything you can for your employees. We also find in brand protection, again, there was a case with a person who took voluntary redundancy in the auto industry and got a 9-month severance package. 9 months later, she still didn't have a job because of the difficulties the industry was going through. And then one of her friends was buying a new automobile, and she told her friend, don't buy from my old company. So even though you think like that you've done everything you can for the employee, the money itself is not going to help them to move on. Okay, and the fourth way that it can support your business is by attracting future talent. So a study done by the Aberdeen Group found that those companies that offered outplacement support were 81% more likely to shorten time to fill new positions. And those that were finding a shorter time found that timeline was reduced by 10% or more. So it does keep your brand value up. And as people start to communicate their employment experiences through social media, you're known as a good place to work. Okay, move on to the next slide. So that's for outplacement. As you can tell, years later, after I had my own experience, when I was offered the CEO role here, I jumped at it because I am I have to admit, I am an evangelist for choosing outplacement. I think you find the cost is reasonable. Depends on what your severance package is, but the cost can be 5% of total cost, up to 20% of total cost of your severance package. And yet the value that it gives to your departing employees is huge. The other thing to be thinking about when you're doing redundancies is how are you going to support your managers through the conversations you need to have. And the last thing you want is probably many of you saw the terrible story circulating from California about 2 months ago with Bird Scooters, where they announced to 400 employees in a 120-second Zoom call that they had lost their jobs as of that Friday. That is the kind of disastrous scenario that you do not want to have in your company. And I understand why companies do that, because they want to avoid legal risk. They want to make sure they're only saying the bare minimum so that no employee has an opportunity to criticize how it's done. It's done uniformly. But I think there's better ways to do that, make that kind of communication. So that, I think, incident is going to really damage that company's brand reputation, and already has. It's circled the globe. So you need to be thinking about getting the right legal advice so that your managers are having those conversations the right way and in a compassionate way, but also a compassionate way that doesn't put the company at risk in terms of saying the wrong things. But I definitely recommend that you do spend time in advance coaching your managers, helping them to have the conversations that they need to have in a way that's both legally right, but also compassionate for your employees. And that kind of compassion can reduce your legal risk as well. Okay, next slide. And then the other thing is, how are you going to reduce stress levels? 65% of employers reported that stress had increased among the employees who had survived one or more redundancy programs. So the things that we've seen with the clients that we work with is those that do it best are constantly communicating with their employees and their managers. So they're not doing a 120-second Zoom call and they're done. They're really letting people know what's happening along the way. And we find that bringing the employees, the unions, the employee groups along makes a big difference in terms of how the redundancy is seen when it actually happens. Offering external support, if you have an employee in EAP program, that's a fantastic resource. Don't forget about it, and don't forget to refer your employees to that. That can help them talk things through. Using coaching to coach, especially your mid-level managers who are going to be probably going through this for the first time and are going to be having a lot of tough emotions. Some of our clients have then taken managing change programs to think about what's new and exciting at the company. So we tend to work with a lot of companies that are going through redundancy. It's a very painful process. But what we've learned is you can't just have your vision on getting to the end of the redundancy and saying, okay, we've cut costs, we're a lean organization, phew, we're done with that. It's just as important to invest and think about, okay, where's the gain? How are you going to grow from this? And what's the future of the company? And bringing up employees along with that. That helps to reduce stress. And then at the same time, helping your employees to refocus on their career development within the company gives them new confidence and new ownership of their career going forward. Okay, next slide. And then this is an ideal opportunity to think about longer term talent planning. So yes, a lot of companies, we fear, are going to need to be doing redundancies in the coming months. It's going to be a very painful process, but don't forget to be thinking about opportunities to rethink your career practices within your company. Redeployment has sometimes got a bad name. It's been done sometimes poorly by HR departments to just force that nobody can be let go without pushing them into another role for which they may or may not be qualified. But I think we're seeing a lot of really great examples of companies who are doing redeployment really well. BAE Systems is one of our clients who has saved £20 million through their redeployment program. And I think there's a lot of fantastic examples out there. Thinking about reskilling and upskilling people for the future. And then if there's any development or coaching needs, they can help you to build your talent. But I think this is a great time to not just be focused on redundancy and the pain that you're going to have, but think about what's coming up next. And that helps reduce the stress on the organization and your managers and the employees that you have. So there are some of our quick tips. And I think next we're able to take any questions you may have.
Indeed, so we're going to have a look at the questions now. We've got one that's come in already, and this is for Kathryn. Can you start redundancy consultations whilst employees are on furlough leave?
Yes, you can. The government has been through various iterations of the guidance on the coronavirus job retention scheme, but in one of the more recent iterations of that guidance, it did clarify that, for example, employees who are furloughed could work as employee representatives as part of a collective consultation process. So yes, that you can collectively consult or do individual redundancy consultation with people who are furloughed, and B, staff who are furloughed can also act as employee representatives for that process as well.
Question has come in. Can you enforce redeployment over redundancy? i.e., is there a legal right to be made redundant?
Sorry, I'm on mute. The position is that it has to be suitable alternative employment for the employee, and as long as the employer can show that you are offering suitable alternative employment, then if the employee unreasonably refuses that, you can actually make them redundant and they forego their redundancy pay. So it's obviously a huge disincentive to an employee to do that. But at the same time, if the employee either reasonably refuses or it's shown that it's not suitable, for example, because it's a big demotion or involves skills that the employee clearly doesn't have, then they would still be entitled to their redundancy payment, and they'd be able to bring a claim in the employment tribunal for that if it wasn't paid by the employer.
What's a reasonable amount of time an employee can be furloughed for before the business has to consider making redundancies?
Under the government scheme at the moment, there isn't any parameters around that. It would just be, I mean, the whole purpose of the scheme is to avoid employers having to make redundancies in the first place. So in theory, you could furlough someone for as long as the scheme continues and then make them redundant at the end of that. And that wouldn't be against the rules of the scheme. So, I mean, it's interesting. I've had a few clients say to me, look, we want to proceed with redundancies rather than using the furlough scheme. And that's because we envisaged that even if the furlough scheme is extended, this was before it was extended till the end of October this week, but even if it's extended till the end of the year, we think our financial position is such that the need for cost reduction is going to extend beyond the end of the year anyway, and is probably going to be this situation for the foreseeable future. And in those circumstances, you can absolutely see the justification for proceeding with redundancies rather than using the furlough scheme in that circumstance. I mean, there's a kind of moral, so legally you're entirely justified in doing that. Morally, it's a difficult one, because obviously employees are going to raise as part of the consultation process, well, why aren't you furloughing me rather than making me redundant? But I think if you've got that genuine business justification of this is going to continue much longer than the furlough scheme is going to be in place, this is our new normal, then you've got the justification to do that.
Perfect, thank you. We've also had a question come in. Are we going to be able to share copies of the slides from this session with the attendees? I'm sure that's going to be possible.
Fine by me.
You after the session. Another one for you, Kathryn. Are you able to make an employee redundant and serve notice while they're on the furlough scheme? Quite similar to our last question.
So yes, you can make them redundant, as I said before, and you can also issue notice of termination whilst someone is furloughed. So you could be claiming the government support during their notice period. There's a bit of a debate about whether, if you're not topping employees up while they're on the furlough scheme, so they're only getting 80% of pay, I think the accepted position is that you should be topping up their pay whilst they're on the notice period, so they get 100% of pay for their notice period, because they are entitled to their normal pay during their notice period.
Perfect, thank you. Perfect. We've had another question coming for you, which is, how does outplacement get delivered? Is it on site at the company offices or elsewhere?
Great question. Well, in our example, we do have 24 offices that we provide across the UK and Ireland. We also do provide support on a client site if that's what they want. Obviously, right now with COVID-19, we're delivering 100% virtually, which I think is going really well. And we've thought about opening up some of our operations, but we're finding that people, having to be masked up 6 feet away is less valuable than being able to talk to people through the video screen. So it's all options available, and we find different people have different preferences. I think after COVID, more people will be more comfortable with virtual delivery, and we offer both.
Thank you. Another question coming through for Kathryn. What does the government plan to, or does the government plan to reconsider the laws in relation to self-employed companies who might be forced to close their company, but they're not permitted to reopen the business for the next 2 years? But given so much uncertainty, it's better for them to close their business but reopen once the market picks up.
I've not heard anything from the government specifically about this topic. I mean, I guess this ties in as well with the wider debate about the use of personal services companies by self-employed contractors, and the introduction of the off-payroll working rules, which were due to be introduced in April, but are now being pushed back till 2021. And I know there's been a lot of criticism of those rules in the House of Lords during recent debates, which may force the government's hand a little bit into, you know, they've already reviewed the rules once following the general election in December, and decided not to do anything to change those rules. But I wonder whether they will come under increasing pressure to do so, particularly if the government, if the economic situation continues, and you've potentially got Brexit on top of that as well. I think, you know, given they've made the concession once to kick the rules into the long grass, you may find that they're going to do that, or at least change the rules in some way, make it simpler, given the economic situation. And so I don't think it's necessarily about the support that self-employed people are getting. I think that may be extended in a similar way to how the coronavirus job retention scheme has been extended, but I don't think they'll change the rules on that per se, but they might look at giving relief in other ways, like around the off-payroll working rules.
Lovely, thanks, Kathryn. One more question for JC. Would the outplacement costs normally come from their severance package or an operating expense?
Oh, that's a really good question. One of the challenges we find is that when sometimes a company will be like the executive suite and the CFO who are planning redundancies, and they're calculating out kind of what severance package will be offered. But they don't include outplacement in that. And then they roll out the plan and turn it over to HR to implement. In those cases, the outplacement has to come out of operating expense. And this is at a time when the company is really in a financial crisis. So we're finding it's really important, if you want to offer outplacement, to get those decisions in right up front. So it's calculated up in the whole severance package pool. And the CFO might be using a special accounting treatment so that it doesn't become part of operating expense. But we had an issue with one client where they were doing a tremendous amount of very good packages for people that were being let go. But in the end, it was literally like 2% of the cost that was an outplacement program, but they could hardly afford it because that came out of operating expense. So it's really important that HR is brought in right from the beginning when you're doing the financial planning for severance.
Thank you, Jason. We've had one final question come in for Kathryn, semi-related to our question regarding placing employees on notice during furlough. Is it okay to pay the government 80% as long as we give 1 extra week's notice on top of the legal requirement?
That's quite a technical question and a difficult one to answer on the spot. It's going to depend on what your employment contract says about notice and things like that, so it's quite difficult to give a specific answer off the top of my head. But my feeling is that the sort of generally accepted position is employers should still be topping up to the 100% for the notice, and trying to get around that in some way isn't going to go down very well. So I mean, there may be circumstances under which it's possible to do so just from a strict legal perspective, but it's going to depend on the wording of your employment contract and the notice that you've got in there and that sort of thing. So sorry to give a bit of a lawyer's answer on that one. It's complicated is probably the best way to answer that one.
No problem, thank you. And I know I did say that was the last one, but we've had one more question come in, so I will squeeze that one in. And this is, when we've pooled employees together for redundancy selection, can individuals in one pool be on consultation periods of different lengths? If so, if we have a pool of staff who across multiple offices, then we may need to collectively consult in some offices and not others. So lengths of consultation periods may differ across offices. Is that?
It could well be the case, because I guess particularly if you've got less than 20 in one office, then you do it and you're satisfied that that's one establishment for the purposes of the legislation, then you could just do an individual consultation process in that office. Whereas if you've got another office where you've got 30 staff at risk, then you could be doing a 30-day consultation process in that office if it's a separate establishment. So it's going to come down to that establishment test that I was talking about before, but it is entirely possible that that could be the case.
Brilliant, that's great. Thanks very much, Kathryn. Well, ladies and gents, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope this has been useful for you. If you do have any questions, do feel free to reach out to us after this event. We're more than happy to answer any questions that you've got. But from myself and from Mel, Kathryn and JC, thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and stay safe.